And welcome back to the Event Modeling and Event Sourcing podcast with your hosts, Martin and Adam. Martin,
Hello.
welcome back.
Yeah, welcome back. Glad
So
to be here.
apparently your weather has turned for the worse.
Yes, winter is back. So we turned from summer back to snow, which is
So that's
yeah,
not good. All the animals that came out of hibernation have to go back to sleep now.
yeah. Unfortunately,
That could be a bigger problem here in Vancouver because in Canada we didn't kill off all our bears. So there's a
we
real
didn't. Why
the real
not?
danger of the
Yeah,
bears, coming to
yeah,
kill you if they're really hungry. So,
yeah.
whereas I think in the Alps and those mountains, I think all the bears have been and wolves have been shot pretty much. I think wolves still exist,
Wolves,
right?
wolves are still around.
Yeah.
Bears, I don't know where the next bear is, but
Probably somewhere in Russia, right?
yeah, maybe, yeah. I mean, sometimes there are news that a bear is around, but he probably came over from Vancouver, most
Yeah.
probably.
So it's funny because we get bears right in the city sometimes for two different
Really?
reasons. There's
Oh,
so in the middle of Vancouver, it's kind of like the board. It's not really Vancouver. It's the next district over, but it's joined to Vancouver, so it's east of us, and then it's Burnaby, a city of Burnaby, which is right. It's kind of like extended Vancouver,
yeah.
but there's two lakes there, and they drain out to an inlet, and on the edge of the inlet, you can go all the way around to the mountains on the north side of Vancouver, where there's to the north there's nothing but wilderness. So all the bears and cougars and everything that can eat you lives there. And so everything that so when they're foraging for food at certain times of the year, either to fatten up for the winter, or they're really hungry in the spring, they will go around the coast in those little forests, and then of course go up rivers,
Yeah.
sometimes to find more food because there's lots of vegetation around rivers. Well, that little river goes all the way through into the city, where you
Oh,
have
wow.
a giant shopping center and everything, and the lake is right there. So there's cougar and bear warning signs right in the middle of the city. Um,
Wow.
and worse yet, I think there was a bear in a trash can, um, in one of the I think in the north side, and so the trash truck drove through Vancouver through the downtown business district, and the bear jumped out on the street in the in
Oh my
the middle
goodness.
of rush hour in Vancouver. So that was I forget what happened. I think they got the tranquilizer gun and put the bear back in the forest.
Not,
But
not sure I want to meet a bear right in the rush hour. Probably not.
so yeah, so when I'm joking around about the animals coming out of hibernation,
Yeah.
it's a very different situation in Vancouver than Germany. I
Yeah.
mean,
Most probably.
but
Do you
no,
get
on a serious note, there have been children that have been killed by cougars because the school is too close to the forest, and
Oh,
this is a really large cat
yeah.
that you know how cats hunt. They wait until you're not looking. So
Yeah.
small children playing on the edge of the playground were taken a few times, or at least attacked. So
Wow.
that's not an imagined thing. That actually happened in Vancouver here.
Yeah.
So don't build your schools too close to the forests.
Wow. Well, that might not happen in Germany. Most
No,
probably.
I don't think so. Yeah, I think I was talking to someone from Switzerland. They said, "Is there any, what's the animals there, or should I be afraid of going up in the mountains by myself?" Oh no, we've killed the last bear in like 1950 or something.
Yeah. I mean,
So,
I know there are really wolves around, but I have never heard that they have attacked any humans. I hear about sheeps and stuff
yeah,
like that, but humans, I don't think I've heard something about humans.
yeah. Well, I drove through the Rockies last year, and I saw a bighorn sheep cross the road, which is kind of neat.
Yeah.
Those are the really large ones that you see in the nature documentaries with the large horns. So never saw one in my life before, and it was on the side of the road. I think outside of Canmore or something. And if you look at the map of British Columbia, it's quite big. You can fit 3 Polands into British Columbia. So driving across, and it's all mountains. So you're
Yeah.
driving through windy roads the whole time. You could drive 4 hours, and you're only halfway through British Columbia. You drive
Right.
another 8. I think it's 12 hours because the mountains get pretty bad after. So it might be anywhere between 10. I think it's 10 hours to get from one side to the next, driving from start to finish. So
Wow.
it's a big province,
Yeah.
and it's one time zone. So all of the provinces one time zone, and we have 9 provinces.
Yeah.
We don't have 9 time zones, but some of them are, two provinces wide, 3 provinces wide. There's 4.5 time zones in Canada.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I don't
Crazy.
know why they have a half a time zone. Like, programmers complain about time zones being an issue. Like in Australia, it's really bad because you have daylight savings time in the northern one, but the southern one won't have the daylight savings time, and you have 3 time zones there.
Yeah.
Well, in Canada, we thought, well, why don't we have a half a time zone? So on the very east coast in the Atlantic province, they said, well, it's 4 o'clock there. It's going to be 4:30 here. It's like, why? It's like, can you imagine programming for that? Like, it's
Oh,
just
I just
awful.
I just had a production issue last week because of the daylight savings. There was a bug in a database which is somewhere located in the US, which was at the wrong time zone, and because you had these daylight savings earlier, there was some kind of weird bug. So it's still an issue today. It's
But we
not
had a bug. We had a bug with this recording because of it. Because we
yeah,
switched earlier now. I think George Bush or someone said, we got to have like more of this nice daylight, and so we're gonna make it, the first week of March or something, to make the switch instead of waiting for the equinox,
yeah.
or Easter or whatever. So Europe stayed behind. Like, all of a sudden
I think
I'm
Europe is
saying,
in about 2 weeks.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think it's, Easter, right?
Yeah.
Or is, yeah. Anyway, so here, all of a sudden, I'm like, "Hey, Martin, ready to record?" You're like, "What? I'm not ready
Ready?
yet."
Ready
Like,
in five
oh,
minutes?
wait.
What? 5 minutes? What happened?
So I had a good excuse to be early for once, which was nice. So,
No, but
um,
you had a small emergency.
oh
Right.
yeah, no, I had yeah some. So this happened before with something else. I had something on the washer dryer, and when motors spin, they have vibration. So whatever you put on top of it, it better not be fragile because it's going to wander off bit by bit, and that's a little bit more evident with like a washer and dryer. But I did have some bottles for kombucha, empty ones, on top of the refrigerator, and of course the refrigerator has a motor for the compressor for the refrigerator to work, and it's much more subtle. So this little time bomb ticking there, this little bottle just
Yeah.
inches its way across over months over to one side, and then smash one day. You're like, what the hell happened? It's a little time bomb. So had that to clean up. Got the vacuum cleaner out to make sure the glass doesn't get embedded in my skin. And I was telling you earlier that my dad had this piece of glass, and it ended up being in his foot, and he still has it. I think it's at the level of his bone because they're like little barbs, and they keep going, inching inside whatever direction they're pointed in your flesh. They keep going, and I think this is also why it's really dangerous to breathe in any glass dust from cutting glass or stone, because these shards just go through your cells and
Yeah.
your flesh. So be very careful. So that means immediately vacuum up all the glass, and so we had a bit of a delay to the start, although we were early. So
I think now with our talk, I think we are now back on time as
yes,
usual.
exactly. So we're back to the usual. All good efforts to be early
Yeah.
have been thwarted by by glass falling. Anyway, yeah, we wanted to. Oh yeah, we had some updates. Like we're still going to have the workshops coming up, and you have your course almost ready. So you've
Yeah.
been working way too hard this week, I hear, because there's so much work to be done for the course, for the book, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost done. Really, tons of lectures. I'm really looking forward to release it. I can't wait to release this course. Really.
So am I. Yeah, this is amazing. And I had a really long streaming session a couple of days ago on Friday, where I think I streamed for 9 hours. But I think something's changed in me when I started to get the freedom of the dynamic consistency boundary idea. I started to look for more concepts. I think this is what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
Since there wasn't too many new type of questions in our Discord this week, so I think we can talk about kind of what got the ball rolling was really that session, that interview with Allard from Axonic for the Axon framework, where they're obviously pushing the dynamic consistency boundary concept into their framework
Yeah.
very, very quickly, right? So it's really interesting to kind of analyze what has to happen at this point. And we had more things that we've been kind of doing by default in event sourcing that is no longer on the table as you must do it this way. So we're kind of removing some of the dogma out of event sourcing, I think. I'm not sure
Maybe
if it's dogma. I
maybe
would
we
call
should.
it dogma. I think it was good practices, but if you want to do, things to another level or I don't know, evolve the whole thing, you have to kind of go back to the drawing board and look at the reasons why those things existed and where they came from. And I think a lot of it is from the aggregate root and these consistency boundaries being quite rigid, where
Yeah.
now you have to play in a different way when you want them to be more dynamic, more fluid, because you do have more control. And I think this comes from the fact that in event sourcing, we have this way to really understand how we got to a situation because we don't lose information. We always have the breadcrumb trail of how we got somewhere. So that with the whole adoption of event sourcing gives us greater courage and a greater safety net in ideas and other things to push to the next level, right? So I don't know if you've come to the same conclusion lately when you're doing an implementation with these new things in the back of your head. Is it
Um,
affecting how you're coding event sourcing projects?
so, not yet, not yet, because I'm working a lot with the Axon framework, and currently the dynamic consistency boundary is not yet a thing. But whenever I work with it, I always have it in the back of my mind. Okay, how would this look like if I had the dynamic consistency boundary? What would it look like if I could define these boundaries dynamically? And very often I think, oh, I wish I had it already, because you are limited to these aggregates. You're limited to these streams, and you want this freedom. And currently, I don't have it yet. But I'm thinking about this whole concept a lot, and I really think this will change the way we will work in the future a lot because it gives so much freedom. I'm really looking forward to use it in a production system.
Yeah, this is one of the goals of the small little project that kind of ended up being a great experiment. Again, we kind of started this. I think you were there in Vienna last year when we started to,
Yeah.
kind of attempt to build a few of these slices for organizing the unconference, the very conference we were at. And
Yes.
it's almost a year later, and we attempted the same thing in Vancouver in the workshop for of that was in September or whatever. And I've just been playing with this as let's just use it as a guinea pig to show how you build slices. But what it's become is kind of like a training ground for learning some of these concepts of okay, how do I hydrate from previous events. How do I now notice patterns? Because now you start to when you and I really wanted it to not be like you said, influenced by something like the Axon framework, because
Yeah.
that's what you don't really have. It's there to give you stability because the framework gives you things
Yeah.
you don't have to write and all that, and it gives you an opinion of where you put your logic and things like that, which is good. In event sourcing, that's good. I think it was worse in other frameworks because there wasn't this accountability aspect, so you could go wrong, and the framework would actually cover things up for you. Anyway, lots of issues there. I don't think it's the case with event sourcing frameworks. So the idea was that this project was don't do a framework, build the minimal thing that can work.
Yeah.
But what I noticed immediately is that if I do that, I do repeat some infrastructure code over and over again, and I implement things that at the core are the same, like hydration, in different ways. So,
Yeah.
for example, I might use an if statement if my hydration is very simple and I'm only looking for one type of event. Seems like a good idea, right? If statement is a lot simpler than a case statement, a
Yeah.
switch case, select case,
I
whatever
did
it
that.
is,
I did that.
whatever your language supports. Um, and so I don't really need a reducer. Like I can just keep iterating through all the events and jump out once I hit what I want and have an if statement for that, right? So I
Yeah.
don't really need a map reduce, although it could be implemented as a map reduce, right? Most things can be implemented as a reducer, especially in event sourcing. You're always going through this history and you're reducing out to what your state is, and that can be your result. Even though it's a no op for most of the things you hit or whatever, if it's something
Yeah.
simple. So I noticed these patterns of okay, I have an if statement here. I have a map here, I have a reduce here. Well, that's kind of silly. If I make them all reduce, I have the same kind of code. So things will jump out at me when I have something that's out of place. And I actually noticed this this week when I was going through the live streams, is that, okay, moving this to a predictable pattern. This is the whole idea behind event sourcing and event modeling,
Yes.
is the predictable, simple, small patterns,
Yes.
and actually extends quite well into the implementation. That while yes, event sourcing gives you great freedom to, take the history and have whatever function execute on it and give you the result. Correct. That is the ease of which that you can do that. But if you're looking for cadence to go through multiple pieces of functionality, there's value in predictability. And if in each different command I'm looking at a hydration or a read model or a state view, if I'm looking at the hydration piece using different types of code, then I have to always put myself in that mind. It takes a little bit of extra. Like, okay, now
Yeah.
I'm dealing with an if statement, or now I'm dealing with a map. Now I'm dealing with a reduce. Now I'm dealing with something else, custom code, a for loop or something for each. I don't know. It could be like 3 or 4 different things that I do, and there may be totally ad hoc ones that I do. And I don't want to have to jump through that extra hoop. Not that I'm going to look at previous slices, right? But think about someone learning how to do the slices quickly. Now they're like, okay, which one do I do here? Do I do a reduce? Do I do a map?
What's the
Wait,
pattern here?
so for a junior person, that's not very helpful if they're trying to learn the concepts, because they'll look at your production code. Senior people, sure, they'll definitely know what's going on. They'll have enough experience in general programming that they can really, in their mind, draw a boundary as the input and the output. And like, I don't care if it's a reduce in here. I don't care if it's a filter. I don't care if it's a map. I don't care whatever it is. It's going to give me the result I want, and I can ignore the stuff in the middle. A junior person is like, oh, maybe this is doing something special. Why does this look different?
Oh,
Right?
and also AI. I often use
Well, that's where I was going. You stole the idea from me.
as an example for AI. I very often do this. If all the command handlers look different, that makes
Yeah.
it difficult for the AI. Definitely.
Exactly. So it's not even that you have to train AI and all that. It's that you have to have a small enough set of patterns so that it does things incredibly well. And I noticed that if I give consistency to how I do reducing of looking at the previous events, and my naming is consistent, AI is incredibly powerful. Like all of the, it's really a reflection to the quality of your solution, right? So if anything, while I say that code quality doesn't matter, it matters, but it matters for a different reason. It doesn't matter for the reason that I'm going to go and maintain that code. It goes for the reason that I'm going to be making a body of work for consistency, for learning. And it's good that I can fall back to ad hoc hackable code, because let's say I have this consistent code. I can fix something by replacing a slice because it's an emergency, and I can hack the code in there. I'll skip the reducer. I can put in some if statements, but I quickly see that I'm getting the results that I want. The bug is gone. I deploy it. Done. I know that that code is ad hoc. It's bad. It's not what I would want people to look at. But I also know that unless well, actually, I know that I'm never going to have to look at it because it's doing what it's doing. If there's any further issue with that slice, I will again erase the whole thing and do it from scratch. Maybe this time I'll have more time and I'll be able to just work on it. But this was a production issue. I need it fixed 15 minutes ago. I'm not going to go and do anything else except get that projection fixed, and that's the only thing I'm going to do. So it's interesting. So what are some of these patterns that we noticed? One of the things that I noticed is hydration. When we look at state view and state change, really they're not that different. They're very different in terms of intent. They still get their blue and green boxes because you have to show direction of where the information is flowing in or out of. Like if you're talking about event modeling, what's behind me in the diagram. But in terms of the components, everything is just a reuse. I think we touched on this a little bit in the last episode, that everything's a reducer. So
Yeah.
when you're doing your command handlers, in your traditional aggregate, you have to say, well, what's my current state? So you look at all the past events for this order and you play them back, and then you see, okay, hey, I'm in this state. Now let's look at our command and what do we want to do with this order at this point in time? Okay, I want to add another line item, or I want to change the address, or I want to pay for it, or whatever it is that I want to do.
Yeah.
I take that data, if any, and I interrogate the state that I'm at and say, all right, this worked, and I'm going to output another event to mark that it worked, and it goes in the same stream of events as the same order. This is just like the shopping cart example. It's just a accumulation of the events over time,
Exactly.
and then we project it. So, but we have this idea that there's this hydration piece, and we also use the hydration piece the same way in the state views, the read models, right? We iterate over the events. Okay, so now they're not so different, are they? Like they're both looking at this history. So we have a common function called hydrate, which we often have. But in the command handler, we have this satisfy our invariance. So once we've done the hydration, we get to the next point. Okay, now that we've done that, we got to do the validation and see if we throw an exception or we mark this as being successful and add another event to our history, right? So we have two components really in here in terms of logic. Now, people have argued that that doesn't exist in the read side, in the state views. But does it? Especially when we think about dynamic context boundaries and what it opens up to the indexing world, that we have dynamic boundaries, that we have the same concept really in this state view, in the read models. Because what do we do when we have a large projection? We usually have a where clause on that table to say, well, I'm just showing one order for this user or the current order. So there's these read models typically are implemented as a table with that you're going to run a select statement and you're going to have a where clause probably.
Some
right? That's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Right. And now if you're running as user 123, your where clause is going to say where user equals 123. And if you're 234, user 234, and you get to the same workflow step, you're going to have a where clause that says, where user 234. So while there's to make that read model, that table exist, there's no extra functionality that you do when you make the projection. In other words, when events come in to affect orders, they change this table. But which orders you see on your screen is determined by who the user is.
True.
Is that, in terms of the mechanics, that's kind of similar to a piece of data in the command handler. But if we think of a command and a query might actually have some data in it, such as a callback function, or a match, like something like a GraphQL where you're kind of matching based on properties or something. User ID equals this, and I'm only going to match records that have that same property. So whether it's a function or whether you're looking at comparing data points, it's going to filter stuff out. So now there's two components to each, right? Even though the calculation is done at a slightly different level. What if we do the calculation at the time of the query and just use anything in between as a caching mechanism? So let's redefine the state view as a command handler, where instead of a command, we have a query, and the query has extra data, such as, yes, I would like to look at my orders, but my extra data here is where user ID equals 123. So now I have a very similar structure to both how I implement my state views and state changes. The only difference is the direction of which the information is traveling, right?
Yep.
With the query, obviously, I have information traveling out, and this is back to what's it called? Separation of query and state changes that we have CQS. So not CQRS, but the predecessor from the OO world, saying that, hey, every single method should either change state or give or return
Yeah.
state. So this
Either
is
or.
still
Yeah.
alive and well in this, but what we're doing is we're really dialing back what we had in CQRS to really have these other models where the where clause is kind of outside of the concern of the management of information, and we're pushing it up in importance as we dismantle the consistency boundaries on the read side. We can also dismantle the consistency boundary on, well, it's not really a consistency boundary because we're consistent at this point. It's just a read operation. But there's a context. So this is where dynamic consistency boundary can be interchanged with dynamic context boundary because it makes sense for read models. Because there's no consistency that we have to worry about
True. Yeah.
for the read models and the state views. So does DCB, does the C stand for consistency or does it stand for context? It could be one or the other depending on which you're discussing. If you're discussing having dynamically, so here's the other problem, right? We've also said, and this is also for the write side and the read side, so command handlers. When we have our hydration, what's stopping us from having the event handler in the hydration process for having some information from the command to project exactly what it needs to project? What's a good example of this? Where the command data will reflect what you're actually going to do down inside the actual event handlers in the hydration piece. That's important because that can also be used to help fetch less data. Use an index that'll allow you to iterate through fewer events because you're pushing that behavior down to the furthest point it can be effective at. And we've ignored that. And that's been a big criticism of event sourcing, is that you're doing all this unnecessary fetching of data and processing excess data. Okay, fair enough. Let's build up indexes that allow you to reach whatever data you need so that whatever command data you have can actually be used inside these event handlers, where the hydration thing was quite a kind of generic before, where you're saying that, okay, I'm just going to replay all the events for this order because I'm going to even because, for a specific command. But now let's dive even deeper. Let's interrogate the actual data inside that specific command. So not only do we move from having an aggregate object, aggregate root and aggregate object, having multiple command handlers, now we've moved to, okay, let's not have an aggregate root with dynamic consistency boundaries. That goes out the window. Now let's have a command object. We have multiple commands instead. Each will have a slight variation of what the aggregate would have had. Let's go further. In that command, in that each event handler inside those things, it can also be fed some information from the command to further reduce what it's looking at, which is quite interesting, because you could skip entire events even for the same command handler. Like, I'm trying to think of an example. There could be a cancellation, and there's a reason for the cancellation as a property. Okay? Cancellation could be done by an admin for fraud. That means it's still canceled. I don't want a different type of event, but I don't need to look at any events at all.
Yeah.
If I have a cancellation for failure to pay, I might have to look at whether something's on back order, and maybe that's going to be okay for now. I'm just going to have the shipping delayed. So I can have that kind. In other words, we can start to interrogate better, like what happens in there. Does that make sense? I don't know. What's your take on how far we can take the dynamic consistency boundary and dynamic context boundary now?
Oh, yeah. So it's very interesting. Sounds like a very interesting experiment to me. to simplify all this stuff. And I'm pretty sure what you describe here happens right now in many frameworks. I know that Axon is working exactly on this indexing part, and I think many other frameworks also work exactly on this part. And combining this, the command handler and the read model, the queries, in that way, it sounds very, very interesting to me, because I worked on my course this week, and I'm not using any framework at all, like you do in your project here. And I recognized exactly the same pattern. You do the same thing in the command handler as you do in the read model. It's exactly the same thing, exactly the same code, because you need the state on both sides. So yeah, very, very interesting. I might start to experiment exactly with this approach also in my Hobby project.
Yeah, because I mean, it impacts the code. We talked
Yes.
about the fact that now, in a traditional CQRS implementation, you kind of, in these larger frameworks that are out there for CQRS, et cetera, they're still born of the era of enterprise architecture thoughts around event-driven architectures and message passing between different services, SOA, and all of this stuff, and domain-driven design, and a lot of it is still sitting at the object oriented kind of view of the world from 25 years ago. I think a lot of it is still sitting in that kind of mentality.
Yeah.
What I'm finding that in those types of solutions, you kind of see why people have this criticism of async in, some things being always asynchronous and eventually consistent in event sourcing type of situations. Oh, and it's really hard to understand what's going on because the read model's not updated yet, so I don't have the data there. All this whining and complaining, that's really throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as they say, because you're working off, if you're doing event sourcing, you're working off of this evidence of how you got to somewhere, where all this other stuff is a minute issue in terms of the value you get by having a reliable audit trail for how you got to any place, not only from the testing perspective, but from maintaining production systems, from migrating schemas to the next one. All these problems that are just horrible in the real world go away with event sourcing. So I don't care about these complaints, but let's address them anyway. So, even from an implementation point of view, it's the complaint about things being disconnected, asynchronous, too separated. I don't know what's going on with this because it's getting data from this command, which is defined in this file over here, and then I have this event in this other directory of events. I have to copy look at the schema to what it's, how it works, and I have this, maybe I have this registration service that maps what state views listen to what events. I have to update that, and I'm trying to look at 5 different things to get my one feature done. I'm jumping around in the code. Moving to this way of understanding that I need to be able to inject the data that I'm submitting from the UI to be immediately used at the deepest level needed for making that command succeed, which would be all the way into the event handler as part of the hydration.
Yeah.
Let me explain what I mean. Because if I'm, even on my simple project, where I'm putting in some sort of a command handler to get a slice going, I have to jump down to a function down below to where I have my reducer basically giving me my state, and then I do my invariance and I return an event. And I know that that's done in this way, and then I go back to the post handler, so where I have my app.get, app.post, whatever I have in my what's called Node Express project. I'm flying around between this and that. And if I have another issue, if I want to adjust something with the framework, I have to go to the top of the file. At least I have everything in app.js, because I kind of wanted to not have to jump around too much to show these concepts outside of a framework. Like, it's a learning thing. I don't want you to have to go, oh, let me explain to you the layout of this application. And here we have our commands. Here we have our commands. Here we have our read models. Here we have our registry. Here we have our schemas. Here we have our database. Here we have our blah, 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 and on and on. By the time you're like understand all that, you've forgotten what you're learning about event sourcing. So I don't want all this, traversal of all these different files just to understand what's going on. So I wanted one file, app.js, where you have everything. Every slice is a section of the app.js, right?
Everything is in one file, right?
See how you move, right?
The whole
So
project is one file, right?
yeah, pretty much. I mean, views. I could cram in the actual HTML for the views in there. I might just for fun, but I said people are kind of used to seeing one file for one HTML page, so I'm not going to make you do that. That will be a separate file, but there's a point where maybe I would. I don't know. I'll try it. So that's the only part that's kind of sitting there. And one of the reasons that that's there is because the only framework that I have in there is the one for the HTML stuff. If I dropped Express, if I dropped Express and really used strings to push out HTML and had my own templating in there, which I did actually a couple of years ago just for fun, to show how easy this is. Yeah, I might still do that. Might bring that code back, but that's the only one. I don't want you to be distracted by HTML parsing and template parsing to run the project, right? That code would kind of get in the way. So that's one of the reasons that I didn't. But everything else is in that app.js, the single file for all code that you're going to at least have the business logic in. But anyway, even in there, in this section where I'm changing some command or making some command, implementing some command, I'm jumping between too many things. So this is where the fact that I don't want a function, I actually want a command object, and I want a function that processes the command, because there's, like we said, we already have some common things between state views and state changes in terms of the hydration having the same thing. But I've noticed also that in the hydration, something that's very simple, I can have an if statement. Something that's a little bit more complex, I might have a map, and another one I might have a reduce. Yeah. But all of those things can be done with a reduce. I'm now looking at stuff that I did before, and like, if someone was to use this project for learning, this concept of having a map or a filter or a for each or a reduce at each different command might actually throw them off. Like, that's not a good way to learn. So, but if all of them are implemented as reduce, and all of them have a case statement for the type of event and what's going to happen when that event is processed, and I'm working with a reducer function, I know that I have a common feature of function signature of accumulate of our state and the event that we're processing at each point. So I have a very similar way or identical way to deal with every single event and every single hydration for every single command. But it also extends to the state views, the read models. I can have the same opinion there. So now what I'm seeing is that I can now move, instead of having a function that does my command handler, I have a command object. And not only in that object do I have a command handler function, but instead of a command handler function, I have a collection of event handlers, which the framework, quote unquote, or my one function will iterate over as it gets all the events. I also have another step there, the invariants. The invariants also will do just one thing. They'll have state, and they'll either return an event, an exception, but if we rope in the query side, I can also return a model. So I can have 3 return types. And the framework can decide, if I have an exception, obviously I was doing a command and I failed. If I have an event, obviously I succeeded and I can do something here. And I have a model. And if I get a model back, I know that I'm not going to allow an exception to bubble out and all that. And I can now superimpose, my own custom handling for HTTP. So I have nice error handling depending on what happened, whether this was a read model, whether this was a command, whether this was a command that failed. I have all those scenarios taken care of. But it's interesting that now we've really made event sourcing just a reduce, a map reduce always. And so,
so in theory,
but I think the point of going kind of full circle from aggregates being objects from OOP to doing the functional approach to then going back saying that I actually have functions, but I need to split them up because I don't care about a giant function. I actually want smaller functions for each event handler. And so I need to wrap them around with an object or maybe a function that returns an array or of these event handlers, whatever. I mean, if you're so opposed to objects in JavaScript or something else or classes, and you want to keep the functional paradigm going, you can certainly have a function that returns an array of event handlers if you want to implement it that way, which is fine. To me, it doesn't matter. That's an implementation detail. And I have a for loop here that does all of them. I mean, you could even have a function that, has some sort of a format where you're going to execute each one of these based upon whatever. So you can play around with the syntax to really hone it into something that's quite predictable. But the end goal of that, because I have an object now, or a concept of an object that is a command, with that command having sub-objects called event handlers, is that I can inline that right at the post. So when I have a post and I have, let's say, some parameters from the UI that someone's typing in some fields, those come in to the same command object and can be introduced directly. That data can be introduced into the event handlers for the hydration. So that dynamic consistency boundary is now something that can play at the event handler level, which is quite interesting. The only thing that the last place that I'm looking at now is really, do I have a choice of even, ignoring some types of events? And when we look at the types of indexes that we make on top of our event stream, whether I can take advantage of those indexes at that point, knowing what commands, what data I have in my command, or on the query side, this is a parallel way of looking at it, because now we've made everything a reducer, and so the post-processing after the hydration on a read model or a state view is different. It's saying, I'm going to remove a whole bunch of extra fields that I don't need, that were helpers, maybe lookup fields for product names or other things, things that I need to map an ID to an actual name. When I'm actually returning the model to the UI, I don't need a lot of those IDs, right? But they exist as data. So I'm going to map and clear that up so that I have exactly the model that the page expects. So there's a second step. And we also have a where clause that also cleans up, these are the records I don't want because I'm user 123. All those concepts are exactly the same as with a command, where I can inject any of those concerns at the level of hydration instead. And if we have an abstraction for the level of hydration, at the level of hydration, that can take advantage of any indexing that we build onto our event store, we have all of a sudden only the data that we ever need for any of these things, which I think is going to be a much better way of working, because we now don't have to process extra information. I think, this example of having a cancellation for a different reason, one might be simple, where we only have to invoke one type of so for a cancellation we might invoke only one type of event handler, right? Or none, if it's an admin canceling the whatever because of fraud, that this is canceled no matter what the history was. I don't even need to hydrate. Perfect. That's an amazing way to look at it. But we need to really experiment with where that logic can be done in a consistent way across everything. Because where would you put that logic? If I have, let's say, for one type of command where the user is admin, maybe, or the reason for the cancellation is admin override, where do I instruct my generic command object interpreter to not bother replaying any event? Because I'm looking at event types required, empty set.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Right? Where do I look at that? How do I make that a generic thing? But these are the next chapters of event sourcing, I think, when we're doing that. And we only do that, we can only get that insight by deconstructing everything, throwing things out, building up from scratch, taking from the lessons we learned over the last 15 years or so, 17 years of event sourcing and CQRS and all that, tearing this down and building it back up, knowing what our concerns will be, knowing what work we didn't want to do, but we had to because we made decisions to treat something in a generic fashion, or put things into one bucket where they don't really belong in a single bucket, and things like that. What are your thoughts on this type of, taking the concept of dynamic consistency boundary and really driving that dynamic consistency boundary, the fact that we're dynamically processing just what we need at any of these concepts? What do you think of that?
I really like the way you question some of the fundamental truths we all know with your project here, and try to push the boundaries further and further. I really enjoy that. Obviously, normally this would be the time to show some code. So if the people are interested in what we are talking here, what we are discussing here, is this code already available? Can they see this code already in GitHub, or where?
Yeah, I mean, I've done a 9-hour stream 2 days ago using that code, where I was just starting to look at it, because I think in that stream where I was at in terms of thought process is that, okay, I've found a better seam for logic. I know that my hydration piece and my mapping, for example, in my state views, should be separate. And likewise, my invariants for my command handler should be separate from the hydration.
Yeah.
I noticed that, okay, now I can abstract that to be a state change function, which now has 2 steps, the hydration and then the invariation, as 2 separate function calls or separate areas of code.
Yeah.
And I looked at that and I said, okay, well, look at this state view. It also has the same thing. It has hydration, then it has mapping. But then I thought, okay, well, mapping is we also have this idea of the current user. And I think where the light bulb kind of came on in my head is that I have, in this example application, we have a conference organization software, and it's an unconference where people suggest their own topics. And so the way that you vote for topics is you check box. There's a checkbox, and you can say I want to vote for this one. I want to vote for this one, and that ends up being a command. So then part of the problem is that when you show the state view for that, the read model, when you show that on the screen, you need to keep in mind what your votes were, and you also have to keep in mind what the total vote count is. And they come at different levels of calculation.
Yeah.
The total count doesn't matter who the user is. You just see this topic has 2 votes, this topic has 3 votes. Yep. But the other part is like, I'm user 1, 2, 3, and I expect the checkboxes to be enabled on the things I voted for last, right? So that's a state view where you have a calculation, based on who the current user is. Now, do I pass that in from the query, because the query string contains my ID and all that? It could be a token, it could be behind the scenes. I'm using a very bad security model on purpose. The user ID is in the URL. That is how it works, but it's there on purpose so you can see exactly what's going on. It's a teaching tool. It's not something you could easily flip it to be in a cookie or a token or some other framework for tokens, or a database, and keep it secure in an instant. But for the purpose of learning, keep it in the URL so that I can quickly edit the URL and see what another user sees, just like that. Right. Yeah. So it's fun to experiment with this concept there. So when I was looking at these structures, I noticed that the state view function was very similar to the state change function, especially the type of code. So you have this idea that you have the hydration piece exists in both, and you have a post-processing piece that exists in both. For the
Yeah.
command, it's really about looking at your invariants and deciding whether you're going to throw an exception or whether you're going to spit out another event to make sure you're moving the state along one extra step. In the state view, you have a mapper, which primary function of that is to kick out the extraneous information that you used for your lookups. Um, and then traditionally what we do is we throw that back to the next layer, and that's where you have your where clause applied to it. So you have your filtration done because I'm user 123, so I get to see this. But in this case, it was like, I need to have these checkboxes put in here. So I needed to know the current registered user that's being used so that I could adjust the model to have the checkboxes, checked off. Now I could push that all the way up to the top layer instead and say that the UI is just going to see who the registered user is, and even JavaScript could just turn those off and on based on who you are, because the model could pass back who voted for each subject. It doesn't need to be just a count, but I could actually have a model behind there to show that. So I could push that all the way up. I don't want to, though. I don't want to. That model adjustment after the hydration in the state view, I want that to actually be done at the earliest possible time, where I can calculate the total amount of votes and put that in as a number. I can also highlight which row has to have the checkbox enabled because what the current user is matches up to who voted for that. And then I need to also clear those out and pass that model back as being exactly what that page is. I want my UI to be a select star always. My model doesn't need any manipulation. It just immediately is applied to the template, and it matches like a hand in glove. I want that person that's working on the UI to understand that the model is telling them exactly what needs to be done. I don't need them to understand that they have to ignore these things. These are just for lookup. This is for whatever. I want it to be hand in glove. It needs to be exactly what it is. And so this, voting topics page really needs to be, what are the topic names? Who suggested each one? Like, not an ID of that person. The person has to be their first and last name, and it has to have the number of votes, and it has to have a checkbox that's either on or off if you're the one that voted for it or not. And that's it, right? So how do we do that? Not at the UI level. How do we do that at the most responsible level, where we get back from our framework the model that we intend? And that means we have to inject the functionality at the right level and get it down to the furthest level as possible. So you have, a real interesting way of working with things. And how you simplify that is really by making a command object instead of an aggregate. You make a query object instead of a function that just does all these things or is a select from a database. If you make a query object, you can place in callbacks for all those things or collections of things. Like, you can start to really experiment with that. So I think this project is going to kind of show what you can do if you really push the functionality to be as close to data as possible in a responsible way. But more importantly, it's going to keep, what I'm noticing is that I'm going to be flying back and forth in the code less and less. I will literally have a post, app.post for votes to vote for something, or app.get for my votes. And in there, I'm going to have a query object. In there, I'm going to put in the query is registration ID equals to the registration ID I just got in the post or in the URL. I'm going to have, the handlers right there, and that's it.
Because you somehow you put all this information into this one object, which is really appealing to me. I need to look up the code, so I really need to see how you did it.
And the interesting thing is, I need the same view somewhere else, or do you? So this actually prevents you from making single green boxes to do multiple things, because you want the functionality to live right next to the handler for that page. If all of a sudden I have this urge to make a, oh, this is how we get votes, now I've pushed the problem back to where I was before, and I have to fly around that coupling, right? The fact that I have to fly around in code is a sign of coupling, because I've defined somewhere in my code base how I'm going to handle viewing the votes, because I can fix a bug and it'll work everywhere else. Well, the converse is true. You make a bug, you're going to break a bunch of stuff, right? So if you think about the dry principle, the bad side of dry is that yes, you can fix it in one place, but you can break everything in one place too.
Yeah, exactly. That's the other side.
Right? And this is where the evil side of the coupling comes in, is that now you have a coordination problem with so many different people and opinions on how to do things. So I would rather have that in an object that's an anonymous object. I don't have the way to get votes. I have this page shows the votes this way, and I see in code exactly how it handles all the history for all the things that happened in voting to do that. If I have another place where I need to show the votes again, I want to copy paste that object, that anonymous object, and tweak it just a little bit to what I want in that particular place. That's the
Nice.
how we battle the dry problem. Because we will have a more standard way of doing this. In other words, we're doing a reduce for everything. We now have a very easy adjustable copy paste. So every time I'm copy pasting the code to do another version of it, it's not entirely novel. I'm adjusting one of the event handlers.
Yeah.
I'm adding another event handler. I can very clearly see the difference in there. Instead of going through a unified way of doing things and swimming through if statements, because, oh, if I'm doing this, I might have to do that, and because I'm taking care of all these different slices to be done with this one central way. So now I'm swimming with complexity, cyclomatic complexity with nested if statements, depending on where I'm using something. This centralization is really helping me there. No, it's not. What I have now is multiple different ways where I can just compare them side by side and say, oh, this view is changing things this way. It has an extra event handler. The rest of the functions are identical. I can semantically look at the difference of how this works. I'm not swimming in some garbage if statements wondering if the condition is going to be true or false because I have 50 ands and ors nested, chained together, because this thing's taking care of 15 different parts of the workflow. That's garbage. That is how we got into this problem in these problems in software, right?
Yeah.
So now I can look at these query objects side by side, and if you have this way of saying, I'm not going to have an ad hoc reducer, or sorry, my hydration is not going to be an ad hoc. It always will be a reduction, and therefore, if it's always a reduction, I can always have an object for each event handler in there.
Yeah.
Now, when I compare them, I'm looking at similar Lego blocks. This one's missing these ones. This one has this one.
You can compare them. You can compare them very easily. I like that a lot.
So, you want to get to the next benefit of this? Testing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh my God. Well, I already told you that the testing has changed entirely because we don't have unit tests at all. The unit test functions don't exist because you're just looking at the previous history of the events that happened, and you're comparing whether you have that event that you expected on the other side. And so it's just a property comparison. I didn't even bother with it. Why am I doing an object compare? I just do a JSON serialize and on both and see if they're the same strings. Yeah. All that property comparison is gone, and it's a generic unit tester that runs all the unit tests the same way for everything. So now, but I have three things in there, which is a problem. I have the way that I test a state change, where it's a given when then.
Yep.
And I have the same for an expected failure, given when then. That's the second case. And I also have one for a given then for a read model.
Yeah.
How can we make it the same thing? Well, the only thing that changes is the result. Do we have a when in our read models, in our state views?
No.
I think we do.
We do?
And it's our filtration.
Oh, I
for
see.
user 123.
I see.
What that does is it gives the exact same signature for everything. So now everything is an object with a history, with, instead of an invariant for a command, we have both a mapper and a filtration, all in one probably. But not only that, we have them injected into the event handlers themselves and even the event handler coordinator. So we have the beginnings of something that's even more E equals MC squared in terms of understanding matter and energy.
Yeah.
I think we're at that point where we're getting to something so fundamentally similar that solves all information systems. We're getting there. I can feel it in my bones.
Ooh.
And it's just going to come down to how we name the objects, the simple core objects. You know, the atoms and the and how they're structured. We have the electron, the neutron, and the proton. Here we have the event, the exception, and the state view. We have the building blocks of certain things, or it could be the event history, the behavior, and then the result, or whatever it is. We're getting to the point where really once we get the fundamentals down, we will have the right. It's about finding the right shape for how we want to treat state changes and state views.
Yeah.
And I think what we're doing is we're reducing that to be its bare minimum. And it's not the requirement of a framework. It's the requirement of a convention that'll guide the most people through everything. I think that's where we're at.
Sounds very, very appealing to me. Yeah.
Well, we'll see how far it gets.
I mean, I think we made quite some steps in the last few months, at least in terms of understanding how we can simplify things. What you're saying makes a ton of sense to me. So yeah, I'm looking forward.
Because now we have smaller amount of build. So we have three. So we reduced the amount of types of building blocks, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We've also given a good convention and good consistency, and we minimized the amount of traversal between concepts, so that things that change together stay together. Having that object as an anonymous object straight in the apt get is putting the data right beside the behavior that is going to act on it. That is excellent context. That is excellent for AI. That is excellent for a brand new person doing stuff. That is excellent for automation. The people that are making code generators there's so many projects that are doing, event modeling automation now. It's crazy. I mean, you have your Miro plugin. Sam is doing his with an entire code generation. Arian's doing his.
Everywhere.
Yordis is doing another one. Rafael did another one. Bobby did another one. It's just so many different efforts, and we're not talking small efforts. I mean, these are people that are getting funding and building companies on event modeling to do this, because they know that once they have something that can take what I have behind me, snap their fingers, and have it working immediately in production for someone is the holy grail. And they're all after it. They're all going after it, and it's great. And I'm supporting all of them, and you and everyone. And it absolutely will change the industry. There's just it's a one-way street. It's a red pill in the matrix. Once you realize this, it's to look at doing something through CRUD or some other crazy framework that does so many complex things for you. That's a handshake with the devil. You're inviting complexity that you are not willing to look at, and selling it as a simple solution. So, yeah, I think truth always finds its way out, and that's it. And yeah, we're the red pill here. We're getting people out of their pods.
I can tell you exactly the day where I realized exactly what you just said. I can pin it down to the day where the light bulb went off, and I knew, okay, that's what's going to happen, and I see it coming very soon.
So what was that date?
It was in 2021. It was in
Yeah.
2021. I think it was. I need to look it up, but it was November 2021.
No,
Well,
that's very specific.
yes, yes. I read the event modeling articles and I thought, okay, that's it. That's what will happen, and then everything changed.
Yeah, it's crazy, and that was just like a moment of frustration for me in 2018 when something so obvious was still so willfully pushed aside because there was so many agendas out there
Yeah,
of people doubling down on where they got to. And I guess it makes sense when you're just building consulting business or whatever. You don't want your message to change all the time. So you got to put your foot on the ground somewhere that this is where I'm going to build from. And it's very hard to build on things when they're not core concepts. So
it
I
is.
think I'm happy to be dynamic as long as I'm getting to a deeper level of understanding and simplification. And
Yeah,
sometimes it takes a destruction of current ideas or second guessing yourself, playing dumb, putting yourself in the seat of being junior or being an early AI model that has a limited context window. And you know, that's hard for a lot of businesses to do because they can't say that to their clients that, you know, what I'm shipping you today is worse than what I'm going to be shipping to my future clients a year from now.
I can say that. That's hard.
Right? Like, oh, well, then I'll wait to sign with you next year.
Yeah,
You'll wait forever because we'll always be doing the best. And yeah, that's you Accenture can't do that. Large companies can't do that. They need the stability for these large organizations because they're not looking at what's going on. They're just looking at it as change is disruptive and we can't afford disruption. I noticed the same parallel in options. Why can an individual trader be more profitable than an institution? Because institutions can't have edge. Institutions will overpay for security. They have too much at risk. They're about risk mitigation. So when it comes to earnings season, a company is reporting earnings. All the contracts on that company are going to, the prices are going to be super inflated.
yeah,
And after the earnings are out, they're going to be super deflated. So I can always find a number of companies that are going to have a skew in the options price for 1 month from now versus 45 days from now. And I'll buy one and sell the other because I know the volatility is going to equal again. That skew has to be pretty steep, but I can filter them. The reason that this happens is because a large company doesn't care about that small increase in price of the contract because they are hedging. That price for that contract, if it's 50%, if it's 25% more, 10% more, they don't care. They're protecting 45% of a $2 billion investment with those purchases. So being large means you overpay, you're too expensive. Being small, you don't have that risk. You have that openness to risk. I'm not afraid of doing things an entirely different way next year. And I think with Accenture and all these other large companies, you have to look at it from this risk perspective that you see in the finance world. Um, that's kind of like how I see it. There's a very interesting little video that I saw about where you get edge on how you're going to be better. And in finance, it's down to a science, right? It's down to like pennies because the markets are perfect. Everything's automated this way. So
yeah,
how do you get edge? You have to realize who you're dealing with, what the purpose of the investments are, from who's doing the investment to get the edge. And same, I think it's the same here. Although we're a lot slower in tech and adoption and all that, although it's
yeah,
now becoming faster with AI. Like it's really going to be, how am I, just like we've automated the investment world to just be a bunch of algorithms that are set out to buy a whole bunch of whatever stock in whatever time, manipulate the people with some news so that they get scared and they sell. We want to scare the retail traders, get a better price, start to do all this kind of stuff. Man, my tinfoil hat is coming on to my head as I discover more fundamentals of information. I'm starting to think I'm a conspiracy theorist now. But yeah, so when you take the red pill and step out of the pod and understand how information systems work and how the world works, start to connect things together. But yeah,
Yeah.
so anyway, that's kind of an interesting discovery that I kind of had today, and so
Okay.
I'm willing to kind of just I've recoded the whole thing. Like I went in, I knew that I made a mistake in terms of how I not mistake, but an oversight, for example, in the events themselves. I had a meta property which contained the type of the event because it's not the core data to it. Um, and maybe that's where a timestamp would be as well. But I realized that I could have a meta legitimate property, and that would clash with that property. So I needed to all of a sudden move all of my root level properties into a data container. So it's event.data. Whatever property, not just event.property.
Yeah.
I needed to do that. And so it was quite easy the solution behind me is still easy enough to have something that runs that actually does something, but I can change the infrastructure, change the core way that I'm storing events, fundamentally change the concepts and still keep the solution running. Um, it's really showing how powerful event sourcing is. That even if I'm changing the infrastructure of event sourcing itself and the concepts of that itself, the event history is the same.
Yeah.
The application still works the same way. The functions are still the same. The given when thens are still the same. I haven't had to touch that. There's nothing else out there that gives you that level of flexibility. You can agile
Nope.
until the cows come home. This is a different ballgame. This is being able to maintain gigantic, absolutely gigantic solutions with no unit tests and be certain that you're doing things right. That is, nothing else can say that.
I know.
Yeah. Anyway, preaching to the choir, but
Yeah.
it's interesting. So I really can't wait to get back into into the live streams again, and
Okay.
and really get to the core concepts of the dynamic bounded, the dynamic consistency boundaries and the context boundaries, which I now will start to I will say both because I think there's a valid reason. The fact that this actually exists on the read side as well is a good reason. So. But what I want to get this out of the way because the next part is even more interesting to me. It's really diving into building custom indexes at the file level to do the things that we think we need databases for, because I think that's BS, total bullshit. We have an ability to make indexes for the purposes that we need. Our purposes are so specific, so pointed, the scope is so tiny that there's no reason to use a generic indexing engine for anything that we do in event sourcing. That's my hypothesis, and I want to prove it.
Oh, interesting theory. But let me ask you one question because
Sure.
I didn't catch up. Your 9-hour event stream. Did you do this all 9 hours without break, or how did that work?
No, I had a break.
Okay.
It was 4.5 hours, and then another 4.5 hours in the evening.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will need to find time to catch up with that. So you're putting out a lot of.
There's a lot of back and forth, so I wouldn't. I mean, what I will probably do is I will present the before and after because everything's in Git history, so you can actually look at the difference. And the last commit is just horrifically large because I ripped apart all of the events. I had to rewrite all the fake data events because now they have that data thing. So there's like a slew of changes, and I was stupidly changing that as I changed other things. But the solution is pretty simple. So you can see where I added some of this. And I haven't put in the objects yet. I'm basically telling you what I will do next stream.
Nice. Yeah.
But what I did do is I added a different way of abstracting. Some of the first steps of abstracting the separation of the hydration stuff, moving everything to be a reducer, and all of a sudden seeing that the command and the query object are really the same in structure. And now what you have is the infrastructure to just route things depending on what happened, whether your result was an exception, an event, or a state view, you now know the direction of the data and you know what to do.
Yeah.
But um, the core object now can be unified. So whether you're a query or a command, it really is now maybe an action, which will make it easier for AI to do things because you don't have that overloaded term of commands and read models from the CQRS that's going to throw off AI. You're going to have an action, and you're going to have either something going out based on the fact that it's a state, or you're going to have something that, or an exception, or you're going to have something going in when it's a valid event. And so yeah, I think it's the next step, and it's something that we said a long time ago on this podcast. One of the first episodes is really to make sure that when you're doing AI, that you understand where the large language models got their training from, and that's the regular average development. So you got to
Yeah.
hook into the patterns that already exist to make it effective. And I think by having a generic action item or something like that, this is just off the top of my head. I don't know what it will be, but it has to be in line with that type of code that will be working well with the type of solutions that we make with event sourcing.
Yeah.
And so, once that code gets in there, we'll see. I mean, I've been quite impressed so far with how much is auto generated. I'm basically getting the UI, the handler, the all the unit tests, all done from one prompt now, which is incredible. That all of that is coming out from one prompt, but I have a good set of history of how these slices are done. I think it can be even better when I remove some of this extraneous fluff in here and have these common action objects, which all of
Yeah.
them have event handlers, all of them have post processors, and all of them have a decider for maybe if you're putting something out or in, in terms of the direction, whether it's a post or a get, and all that kind of stuff. So more to come, but that'll reduce the code. Like basically every slice behind me is now going to be a get or a post, and in that is going to be an object that shows you what you're going to do. So it's all self-contained. I was
Yeah.
thinking that I need some comments to separate the pieces of code to say where a slice is. I now no longer have that. I can now have a single HTTP handler that is that step. I can have everything in there in a nice structure that will give the perfect context for how we solve each step in the workflow.
Oh, very interesting. I will really
So
have to check out the code. That's
yeah,
really
so we've wanted to do a short episode, didn't we, Martin? We said
yeah.
we're going to talk about one subject. It's too
Yeah.
bad we picked this subject because
I,
it's
I,
not a
I
short
think
episode.
I think it was really interesting. So lot to think about, to be honest. So yeah, very interesting.
Well, just keep challenging the established ideas to tear them down, build them up again, to get a better way of doing things. It's kind of
Yeah.
the way humans have worked. We got better cars by deconstructing some core ideas and building from scratch. Some things couldn't be evolved into a better design, right? You had to think outside the box. You had to throw away your assumptions and your learnings, and I think we're sort of in that area. There's, what did we break in this discussion? We broke the idea that we have to have a single materialized state view and that some other layer is going to inject the where clause. We're saying no, we're not going to do that. We're on purpose going to say that, we don't have a given then. We're going to say that we have a given when then for everything. We just found a better way to understand why there is a when in a state view.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a no op for a lot of stuff. Maybe that is a view that has like when nothing, then I have this. But for others, it's going to be when the user is 123, then my model is exactly what I want. And now that makes your API layer code, like your service layer code, your UI layer code, simpler because you've passed the responsibility of the logic to the level where the data lives. And now you have that feeling of just doing select star to put something on the screen.
Yeah.
that model fits, the UI pretty well. So that's one thing that we threw out. We also threw out the idea that it has to be an aggregate or a stream. We have the idea that a command is the object. It's not the aggregate with an entity that can have multiple commands being done. The command is the object itself. It's not a function. We've moved that as well. We're saying, no, commands are not functions. Commands are objects, but they're not objects like you thought. They're not just DTOs that have whatever you collected from the UI. You actually want a property that says, are you going to implement as a class in C# or something? Maybe. I kind of don't want to. I kind of want to have function pointers and that kind of stuff, but it could be. The problem with a class is now you have inheritance, all sorts of things, and you have an object. So I'd rather have it more anonymous, where I have an anonymous object where I have a bunch of function pointers from a predictably named property such as event handlers, and in there I know that I have a collection of function pointers that have a signature that I know, and they have the infrastructure. So these are the things that we threw, these concepts of a stream aggregate, the fact that commands are different than queries. They're almost identical now from so many more concepts. So that's why we're getting to that E equals MC squared part in all this, right? But all that stuff had to be thrown out. It's like, are you a good event sourcing expert? Are you experienced in event sourcing? If someone rejects the stream and does something ad hoc because they don't like event sourcing or that they feel like their hand is forced, that's different than someone that's coming in from years of event sourcing experience to say that I have a convention that'll give you the same results, same consistency, and better quality with more predictability by loosening the constraints, but getting a simpler convention. Right?
Yeah. To experiment with that, I think you really need to throw away all the frameworks and just play around like you do with plain simple code and simply do experiments. If you work with these frameworks like Axon, for example, which is an amazing framework, but it's really hard to do these experiments to find out where are these walls that I can tear down. I think it's really implementing it yourself, playing around, doing experiments. This is where you find these gems. Maybe that's really a good point.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think it's important to. I think I can draw inspiration from Yordis, who really did say, you know what, throw away your upcasters.
Yeah,
that's coupling. Like, man, I need to be more like Yordis. Because he came at event sourcing not being a shit disturber, someone that's just going to throw the entire concept away because it's not familiar. He came from the experience of doing event sourcing and pushing it forward, not finding excuses not to do it. He pushed through how it can be better.
Yeah,
I think that's a big distinction. And yeah, we all got to be more like Yordis.
We all got to be more like Yordis. I agree.
Yeah. That's the lesson. He's going to kill me if I put this in the title of the podcast.
Why not? I vote for it. I like it. Being like Yordis.
Yeah. All right. I think we went way too long. I'm so sorry. It's one subject, and we said it's going to be just one, and it'll be a fast episode. It was exactly the opposite. Yeah. All right, Martin, I will let you go so that you can enjoy the remaining hour of your weekend.
Yeah, about an hour left.
Yes, exactly. So thank you again for accommodating the time change and the time zone stuff. So we'll definitely be talking during this week to see how the projects are going, and looking forward to working this whole week with you and others. So until next week, thanks everyone for joining us. Don't forget to look up the next workshops, and then the material from Martin's coming up for his book for learning event sourcing. Be on the lookout for that. Links are below. Eventmodeling.org usually has all of them, but just in case, they're all listed in the last screen here. So thanks again, everyone. See you on the next one.
See
Thanks,
you next
Martin.
week. Bye bye.
Bye.